Major events in the church calendar provide us with opportunities for deep reflection. The major events from the life of Christ have implications that fall at the crossroads of spirituality broadly considered, metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, and anthropology. They move us to consider certain fundamental questions on the nature of human existence and our relationship with God. It also moves us to consider not just objective realities, but also man's subjective response to or interaction with these realities. In a word, what are the basic qualities of human thought and emotive processes? What do humans desire, and what should we desire, and why? We see this with regard to the Easter season in particular. An online Catholic commentator who I have deep respect for recently shared a post on Twitter from a Christian writer and blogger whose main area of expertise is the intersection of the psychology of death and spirituality, particularly Christian spirituality. In this post in particular, he speaks of the psychological implications of the theology surrounding Easter. It is these posts in particular that I would like to analyze today, as I feel that they bring up a lot of important philosophical and theological points that we must confront as we contemplate the nature of Easter. Though he was responding to evangelical Protestantism, and in particular evangelicals of a more conservative or fundamentalist bent, who believe in a strict adherence to a literal interpretation of Scripture, his words could easily apply to any branch of Christianity that accepts a more traditional or historically rooted interpretation of Christian theology, including but not limited to Catholicism. He begins by writing, and I quote, "The reason why much of evangelical Christianity is so insistent upon a literal bodily resurrection of Jesus is because the entire structure of their spirituality is based around denying death. The goal is to live forever, and this is achieved by fitting themselves into a religious technology that cashes out that result." Unquote. Now, this should remind us of Freud's belief that religion is born out of a fear of death. Some people, in fact, Freud would probably suggest the vast majority of people, cannot accept the reality of death, and so accept a worldview that includes within itself a belief in the afterlife. That way, they can implicitly believe that death is not permanent, because even though the body dies, there's a part of them that continues to live on even after death. There is some type of conscious existence beyond the material realm. Death is thus more sad for those that they love who were left behind. But for the one who dies, death is simply a transition from one stage of our existence to another. Now, it doesn't seem as if the original poster is saying that exactly. Yet, it seems as if he is saying that those who make the bodily resurrection of Jesus overly central to the Christian message are acting out of a fear of death, which results in a rather simplistic understanding of the biblical message. People who interpret the Christian message in such a way usually fit the psychological profile described by Freud. Now, this showcases the ideological limits of Freudian psychology. By saying that human behavior is driven by subconscious psychological desires, one very easily begins to view human behavior as being ultimately driven by a series of ulterior motives that we are, at best, only partially aware of, but which permeate every part of what we say, do, desire, and think. It would be hard to prove in this vision of the human person that our faith in the resurrection is not simply born out of a fear of death, and certainly there are people who interpret it in this manner. Nonetheless, the author of the Twitter post in question goes on to suggest that we need to go beyond a vision of Jesus based on such overly simplistic visions of who Jesus was and what he did. More on that in a moment. But before we do so, I think that, assuming that human behavior is not purely deterministic, that the psychoanalytical theories on the subconscious are not an all-consuming part of human behavior and perception, that, in a word, there is some room for rational judgment and freedom of the will in human behavior, there are theologically consistent reasons to emphasize the centrality of the resurrection beyond merely the fear of death. It is difficult to look at the Bible and not come to the conclusion that a belief in a literal bodily resurrection was the core tenet, or at least a core tenet, of the theological worldview of the New Testament authors. Every single one of the Gospels speaks of the rising of Jesus. Now, the Gospels were written in narrative form, but simply being written in a narrative form is not enough to affirm the historicity of a text. The book of Genesis, for example, was written in a narrative form, but a lot of Christians interpret this text symbolically, or at any rate, believe that its historicity is secondary to its deeper moral or spiritual message. The historicity of the book of Job is usually not focused in on or emphasized very much. Nonetheless, when you look, for example, at the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of John, the authors of these texts either claimed to be eyewitnesses to the events that they describe, or they claimed to know the people who were eyewitnesses to the events they describe. It is clear that, at least with these Gospels, what they were writing was something they believed to be history. Nonetheless, how do we know that the text isn't history embellished with allegory? How do we know that modern-day Christians aren't interpreting literally what was meant to be interpreted figuratively? The fact that the early church believed in a literal bodily resurrection can be seen, for example, in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians chapter 15. St. Paul clearly affirms that humanity will rise from the dead in a literal bodily sense. He believes that this is possible because Christ rose from the dead, and hence states his belief that Christ is the quote-unquote first fruits of many brethren, unquote. The resurrection was necessary as a way to counteract death, and death, to a large degree, was interpreted in a very specific manner. Death was seen as a result of the corruption that comes about as a result of sin. Sin is a turning away from God, who is the source of all being and existence. Sin, therefore, is not only a form of moral corruption, but also brings with it metaphysical or ontological corruption, that is, a corruption of our very existence. Death is therefore an expression of the ontological corruption that comes about from sin. As I pointed out in my previous video, Saint Athanasius writes in his work on the Incarnation, quote, "When men were bereft of the knowledge of God, and were turned back to what was not, for what is evil is not, but what is good is, they should, since they derive their being from God who is, be everlastingly bereft even of being. In other words, they should be disintegrated and abide in death and corruption." Unquote. He also writes that Jesus' humanity, because of its union with his divinity, was rendered incorruptible. It therefore could not be eternally kept by the bonds of death. Thus, St. Athanasius goes on to write, and I quote, "He suffered not the temple of his body to remain long in the tomb, but having merely shown it to be dead, by the contact of death with it, he straightway raised it up on the third day, bearing away, as the mark of victory and the triumph over death, the incorruptibility and impassibility which resulted to his body." Unquote. We see something vaguely similar in one of the greatest preachers of the Byzantine patristic tradition, St. John Chrysostom. Commenting on Romans chapter 5, verse 12, Chrysostom writes, quote, "The human race having once fallen, all of them became mortal." Unquote. Yet he later goes on to say, quote, "Immortality awaits us, and after having been chastened a little, we shall enjoy the blessings to come without fear." Unquote. We see a similar view in the traditional Byzantine Easter hymn Christos Anesti, which contains the lyrics, quote, "Christ is risen from the dead, by death trampling down upon death, and to those in the tombs he has offered life." Unquote. Now there's a lot more that could be said on this topic, particularly in terms of how the theological and metaphysical implications of death relate to the scientific reality of evolution. Nonetheless, it is clear that one of the main points here is that God is the source of life and existence, and death is the opposite of life. And so it makes sense that death would result from a turning away from God by sin. So what we can conclude here is that there are two general views or mindsets. The first is one that situates death within a larger metaphysical or spiritual framework, rooted in a specific view on the relationship between God and creation, and which is integral to the Catholic view on the resurrection and the mission of Christ. The other is born merely out of a fear of death. A view of Christ born out of the latter mindset usually misses the point of who Jesus is or what he's all about. This is something that both I and the Twitter commentator could agree upon. It is interesting, though, the route he decides to take. He writes, quote, "To suggest a spiritual point of view in which Jesus is revelatory, but not a crudely literal magic man from the sky, is to cast doubt upon the spiritual machinery by which they are living. Some of them say revealing things like, 'I would be at a strip club if the resurrection is not a literal fact.' Such a statement evidences a spirituality that is not based on a transcendent love that brings reunion within itself and amongst the world." Unquote. In some sense, I agree with this point, but it is also in this point of agreement that there is disagreement. The purpose of the incarnation, death, and resurrection is to bring about reunion within itself and amongst the world. How I interpret this claim is that the purpose of the resurrection is to reestablish union between God and his creation, thrown off by the effects of sin, and to reunite us to one another. Sin undermines love, and love, as Jesus, and in a sense the entirety of Scripture, teaches, is twofold: love of God and love of man. Humanity does not love God as it ought due to sin. This thus causes the created realm to become fragmented, both metaphysically, in the sense that we are separated from our Creator, who is the source of cohesion and intelligibility within creation, as well as in a moral sense. Creation is divided against itself because of the strife caused by sin. Therefore, to say I would be at a strip club right now if the resurrection was not a literal fact is, in some sense, both understandable and not understandable. It is precisely because of the incarnation, death, and resurrection which brings about reunion between us and God and union between us and our fellow man, that we are brought out of our sin and given the strength to strive for holiness. Without the grace of God, given to us through and on the basis of the death and resurrection of Christ, it wouldn't take much for mankind to fall into sin. At the same time, one must ask themselves, have they allowed themselves to be radically transformed by this grace? Grace present in the soul creates within us a love of God and our fellow man, and increases in the amount of grace that we receive through the reception of the sacraments, as well as cooperating with this grace by good works, allows our love for God and our love for our fellow man to deepen. Therefore, a person who's in a state of grace does not think, if only things were different, I would be doing something highly immoral. If you are filled with a sense of love for God and love for your fellow man, it wouldn't even occur to you to do anything that's contrary to that love. This is also why we place a strong emphasis on the notion that the death and resurrection of Christ is a defeat of death. The grace of God permeates and elevates every part of our being. Moral corruption is an expression of the larger corruption of our existences that comes from the separation of God, who is the source of life. Therefore, as we are elevated morally, we are also elevated in a more general metaphysical sense. Christ's death and resurrection is therefore both a defeat of death in a literal sense and a defeat of death in a more general moral sense. In a private conversation with the maker of this thread, he claimed that his views were influenced by a variety of different sources and recommended 2 books in particular that I read. One book he recommended was The Dynamics of Faith by the 20th century Lutheran systematic theologian and philosopher Paul Tillich. In it, Tillich defines faith right out of the gate, in the first sentence of the book, as, quote, the state of being ultimately concerned, unquote, going on to say that, quote, the dynamics of faith are the dynamics of man's ultimate concern, unquote. There are many things that compete for man's attention, and man must thus organize, arrange, or prioritize his concerns. Whatever man places as his highest good is what he puts his faith in. Anything, according to this definition, can be the object of faith. An example of misplaced faith used by Tillich would be the extreme forms of nationalism, where one's race or nation is seen as the highest good. Another example would be the greedy and how they view money. Money or financial success are seen as the ultimate good. Faith is, for Tillich, an all-encompassing thing. It includes, in his words, quote, the demands of total surrender to the subject of ultimate concern, unquote. This act of surrender to a higher reality is, in Tillich's words, quote, an act of the total personality, unquote. It is an assent of the mind or the intellect, but at the same time, it includes something beyond the intellect, as well as, at the same time, including or encompassing the parts of man that lie beneath the intellect. It is a conscious, volitional act, but also encompasses the subconscious elements of man. The act of encountering, becoming enthralled by, and submitting to that which we deem to be the object of ultimate concern takes place at the core of man's being, and encompasses the fullness of man's being. Faith is, quote, all-embracing and all-transcending concern, unquote. The source of faith is man's capacity to think beyond the finite, constantly changing elements of his life. Man is capable of conceptualizing the notion of the unconditional, the transcendent, the ultimate, that which, in a sense, hovers above the constant change and flux of day-to-day life, that which is not bound by the same limitations or constraints as normal emotions, objects, or experiences that we see in our day-to-day life. Faith is not merely an act of knowledge based on limited evidence. It is not a will to believe. It is not an emotion that we feel as a result of contemplating or coming into contact with a higher reality. Rather, Tillich views faith as something beyond all of this. With this in mind, Tillich goes on to say that there are a few different components of faith. The first is the ontological element of faith, which is the element emphasized by the mystics. It is the desire to experience or encounter that part of reality which is most fundamental to living a meaningful life, or that which gives intelligibility to life. The next is the moral element, which refers to the way of life that emerges from holding something as the object of ultimate concern. The most important question of faith is, which system of beliefs, which religious teacher reveals to man the fundamental elements of reality and produces a way of life that best accords with this? Which system of beliefs, which religious teacher or leader gives the greatest or most direct explanation of what is or should be of highest or ultimate concern for man? In Tillich's words, quote, "The question of faith is not Moses or Jesus or Muhammad. The question is, who expresses most adequately man's ultimate concern? The conflict between religions is not a conflict between forms of belief, but is a conflict between expressions of ultimate concern." Unquote. It is this which gives Jesus his saving power. The historical conditions surrounding Christ are of secondary importance. Tillich therefore goes on to say, quote, "The New Testament picture of Jesus as the Christ has saving power for those who are grasped by it, no matter how much or how little it can be traced to the historical figure who is called Jesus of Nazareth. The independence of historical truth is one of the most important consequences of the understanding of faith as the state of ultimate concern." Unquote. The other book recommended to me by the creator of the Twitter post was the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker's work, The Denial of Death. In it, Becker asserts that one of the reasons why humanity has a difficult time coming to terms with the concept of death is heroism, that is, the narcissistic belief that evil or suffering will never touch you, that you can charge headlong into danger and inevitably come out the other side. If this is the case, then why doesn't each individual take extraordinary, life-threatening risks all the time? Most individuals and societies hold up as admirable and praiseworthy those who face life-threatening situations for the sake of a greater good, but very rarely do individuals themselves put themselves in that situation. Anthropologists have noticed, Becker states, that most religions, and in particular the mystery cults of the Mediterranean world and Christianity, have elevated the hero to a godlike status, as one who goes into the realm of death only to return victorious. Most modern religions were thus born out of the claim that we too can obtain such a state. Religions are thus defense mechanisms meant to shield us from the emotional sting of having to deal with death. Becker then examines the various psychological, sociological, and philosophical theories meant to explain man's fear of death. Now, do a lot of people, even most people, have a fear of death? Yes. Do a lot of people, instead of psychologically or emotionally coming to terms with the reality of death, prefer rather to ignore it? And does this lack of ability to come to terms with death cause various neuroses or odd beliefs, particularly when faced with the reality of death? Of course. But I don't think that was the main reason why the apostles and their immediate followers believed in the resurrection. I believe that there were certain metaphysical and soteriological reasons for this claim, as well as certain eschatological reasons that we really didn't go over here, but which can be found in such texts as the book of the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 37, the book of Revelations, chapter 1, verse 5, and Colossians, chapter 1, verse 13. Further, it doesn't seem as if the early church was afraid to confront death, especially considering two things. Firstly, that medicine was far less advanced than it is today, and therefore death was far more common than it is today. Seeing someone die at a young age during childbirth, seeing children die at a young age, seeing diseases wipe out entire communities or large chunks of a community, governments using very brutal and very public forms of execution was way more common in olden times than it was today. Not to say that the basic psychological mechanisms that are in play with regard to death denial weren't present. Rather, people had a much greater tolerance to death. But secondly, one of the core elements of Christianity is that Jesus died on the cross. Crucifixion was one of the most brutal forms of the death penalty in all of human history. You would be suspended upon a cross, which would cause you to suffocate under the weight of your own body. This was all while having nails go through your wrists and feet. And if the pain and or suffocation didn't kill you first, the starvation and or dehydration would do the trick. It wasn't like being electrocuted, hung, beheaded, or poisoned, which were usually painless and or relatively quick forms of death. It was this same form of death penalty that would become a symbol for Christianity. Christianity is a religion based on the defeat of death, yet it is a religion that, as a prelude to this, forces us to come to terms with, to confront this element of human existence. But most importantly, we must keep in mind the fact that this reality, that Jesus conquered death, was taken by the early church to be an historical reality. This thus leads to an important reflection on Tillich's thoughts. While Jesus does serve as a means by which man's true nature and the proper order of his priorities on an existential level is made known to him, it does not represent the biblical or historical view that what Jesus reveals existentially or spiritually is or can be divorced from the historical realities surrounding Christ. Therefore, we as Christians who want to remain loyal to the biblical worldview as it was historically understood needs to avoid a purely archetypal view of Jesus. That is to say, a vision of Jesus that emphasizes what he represents in a manner divorced from what he did. And it is this that is at the core of the Easter message.